Hello, everyone. It's Tao,
And Muneezay.
and we're finally back together, though virtually, for another episode of the Plant Planet Plate podcast. Today, we'll be talking about the awesome fieldwork that Muneezay got to do recently in Cambodia. As you listened to our last episode and saw that she was in the Agritech Center with Nick, she has come back to tell us more about her experiences in the field. So, Muneezay, would you like to discuss a little bit about what you were doing in the field, objective-wise, and what you think was achieved?
Yes, most certainly. So I had two main fieldwork objectives this trip. So one of them was really to understand more about transplanting. As you know, one of the goals of this project is for us to have what we call a living library. So a demonstration wild food plant garden at the Agritech Center, which is run by Green Shoots Foundation. And so the main thing was understanding more about transplantation of these wild food plants. How do you grow them? What is the most optimum sort of environment that is available for them? So naturally, we went to the monk community forest for that. And the other objective was to really speak with Net, who is a vlogger who makes wild food plant videos. She does a lot of foraging, and I wanted to just sort of have a chat with her to understand her role as she sees it as someone who enjoys wild food plants, has immense knowledge, and where did she acquire it from?
Very interesting, Manasseh. So I'm sure that our listeners are kind of wondering, how do we reconcile? And I think we've spoken about this in previous episodes, or at least amongst each other. How do we reconcile trying to tame the wild and putting these wild plants into the living library? Some of our listeners might not know, but there are lots of continual efforts around Cambodia as a country to kind of better understand these, quote, wild food plants and their role in diet and health and society. But just sort of trying to recreate those conditions to see if they can be grown as underutilized food crops, right? I'm gonna say.
Yeah, so that is definitely something that a lot of other organizations are doing. So one of them is the University of Battambang, and Dr. Pao, who runs the program there, is one of the more sort of prominent people trying to identify plants based on their nutritional value and seeing how they can be more readily available because they do have high nutritional value. They do add to biodiversity in a farm or in a home garden. And so it's not, and I understand what you mean and about taming the wild. And I think it's more for us, especially having it as a living library, is more for plant identification and it's more for showing it as a demonstrative space. So not necessarily interested in the commercial availability of this plant, but more so we can, when we do our sessions with young people, be able to show them or cook with them and not necessarily have to go to the monk forest or a foraging spot to collect them. And I think that's what we mean by a living library is essentially how you have books in the library and you use them for reference or you see them for learning purposes. It's there and it's one of the many things showcased at the Agritech Center. So they will be a bit tamed, they will be not that wild, and they might miss some of their friends, which by that I mean companion plants, and I will try to get into that as well a little bit. But yeah, essentially they're there to be mostly for demonstrative and educational purposes, because as you will remember in previous interviews, we did bring this up with a lot of foragers or interview participants, and most of them said it doesn't taste the same or it doesn't smell the same. And so that's something that is related to enjoyment of wild food plants as an edible.
What I find very interesting, and maybe our listeners may or may not know, is that when you say like a living library, we have this garden or botanical garden space, which is for educational purposes, and that around the world there are also many different botanical gardens that do the same. Because I think that when I was growing up, the botanical gardens was very much perceived as something ornamental, just kind of a nice place to walk with your family or your friends to spend some time out in nature, but like a very curated form of nature. And I think, Manasseh, you recently sent me an article about the struggle that a lot of botanical gardens are facing because of land development and land use, in the sense that they're running out of space to host all of these different diverse plants in their collection. So, applying that kind of knowledge to our own living library that's just starting, our botanical garden at the Agritech Center, as a collection, it's kind of exciting, but also it feels a bit more urgent in that way.
Yes, I agree, and I think yeah, that article amongst the many articles that I sent you was very eye-opening. It also did make me think of this activity that we are about to do, where we're not necessarily going down the botanical garden route, but we are trying to sort of have them labeled for and be able to young people to be able to see, because a lot of young people that come visit our space, some of them know these plants, but some of them don't. And the other thing that I should mention is that within the space of the Agri-Tech Center, as you have visited, and I hope other people on the listening to the podcast eventually think about being there, is there's many edible plants around the place. So there's firstly what we've done is put effort into labeling them, but then also then having this space where some plants we choose specifically to bring, and I'll talk about them a little bit more. But the other thing that I should mention is that we went this time to the monk forest during the dry season. So it changes again, sort of what is available and what you can see. So that is also very interesting when we think about this idea of transplanting or bringing a plant. When is it available and its seasonality, and trying to observe that over the year if it's on your site.
So, from your experience, Muneezay, how would you describe the seasons in Cambodia? I mean, I can, and there's an official census kind of definition with the seasons of Cambodia. So, what counts as the rainy season? I think it's what it's in May or so, June is when
May,
it starts.
June more likely, sort of May to June, and then November is like the hard stop for the rain, and then it's dry season. So yes, essentially Cambodia is two seasons, so rainy season or wet season, and then dry season. And what we both know is that activities are very seasonal. There are many different things that take place based on the season that we are in, and of course, rainy season is rice growing, and then in the dry season you definitely have more in terms of agriculture, more towards vegetable growing. At times people can squeeze in another rice growing, sort of early rice is what they call it, and that's just straight after a harvest in November, and they'll plant again to harvest in Jan or Feb. But one of the things that Cambodia has faced in the last decade is a lot of drought. So even during the rainy season it doesn't rain as much, so the government has come out and taken out notices to sort of say, please don't do the second harvest because it does impact water resources for the rest of the year. But yeah, essentially, my experiences with the seasonal activities is a lot related to food growing. But I think your experiences is more with how food is processed. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to preface this that I had spent dry and rainy season in Siem Reap and not so much Oddar Meanchey, and we were there during the beginning of the rainy season together in 2023 with Iris. But for places like Siem Reap, which are tourist destinations in Cambodia, the dry season is completely filled with tourists because they're trying to usually escape the winter cold from wherever they're coming from, and they want some sun. And sunny Cambodia is one of the ways that they do that. So even though Cambodia generally is a quite agricultural sector heavy economy, in certain places in Cambodia, these tourist areas, this is where most of their money is actually made through tourism. It's not to say that during the rainy season there aren't tourist destinations. For example, floating villages in Cambodia are very prominent, as well as in other places in Southeast Asia. But people oscillate between their roles for household income. So farmers during some parts of the dry season will go into the city and work at restaurants and work in hospitality and things like that. And because of this switch, there's also a switch in how people are eating and processing their foods. For example, in my research with traditional medicine plants which are harvested during the rainy season because they grow with that abundant amount of water, they are dried or made into a decoction and then used throughout the rest of the dry season because they're no longer available fresh in that way. So aside from medicine, through dried in decoctions. There's also preservation of different foods. So the rainy season, we have a lot of like frogs and wild fish and all these different things. People often preserve them either through sun drying to make tringet or they make trahok, my favorite, fermented fish paste, which Muneezay is laughing at right now.
I'm laughing more at Trinidad because that's my favorite, the dried fish. And this time I saw a lot of people starting to put out beef jerky. So they were drying beef as well, which is quite, I think, nice when it's fried and had with as a snack. And so yeah, so it's for me the first time that I experienced this idea of seasonality in true form was also when we were first raising fish at the Agritech Center, and we didn't get our timing quite right. When our fish was really large and ready to be sold, it was smack in the middle of rainy season, and we just did not get a good price because fish is everywhere. It's in the paddy, it's in the lakes, it's in the rivers. And it just really made me sort of kind of hone back in on this idea of planning according to the seasons quite literally and knowing what is available when, which I think is something that, truly is to be appreciated.
Yeah, I think that we kind of lose that sense of seasonality with our very, like I said, modernized and globalized food system where seasons kind of don't exist in some grocery stores anymore. Like, how is it possible that I'm eating a tomato or the idea of a tomato at this time of year? And as we've said in past episodes, and also just maybe our listeners have been to Cambodia themselves, like, a lot of the eating is quite seasonally linked and oriented. I was thinking about how a dish that my mom and I used to eat as a kid was rice and trenyet. And then she would get slices of watermelon, which is like salty and sweet. And I kept
My
thinking, this is
my favorite.
weird, a freaky pairing. And then I went to Cambodia and saw everyone doing it. So she really kept that up. I'm gonna say that's dry season eating.
That is dry season eating, and it's very hard to find it at other times of the year. And so yeah, so I thought maybe what I could do a little bit now is kind of do a little bit of an idea of being in the monk forest during the dry season. So firstly, what I want to sort of really say is that dry season doesn't mean that there are no trees, there are no leaves on the trees, which is what we expect over here. When it starts to get winter, all the leaves fall down. So it's still very sort of full and lush as a forest space. But one of the things that we sort of had when we walked through was that there's a lot of leaves on the ground. So leaves are being shed. And the ground is just really, you can't even see the path. It's so many leaves. But what is really interesting is that it still kind of indicates sort of food availability. And one of the notes that I made was that the variety is still there. So it's not like, oh, there's dry season, there's not going to be enough any wild foods. The variety is still there, but it's different. So it's more fruit and it's more leaves that are being eaten. So it's not kind of things that are cropping up and in abundance as we spoke, which is usually the wet season. Yes, the abundance is different, but the variety is still there. And there was what I noticed a lot was that during the rainy season, when we walked through the monk forest, we were really looking at the ground because anything kind of cropping up like mushrooms and sort of flowers like proswa is flat and it's on the ground. And we were just really sort of, not taking in the space and its largesse, which I really noticed walking through the dry season. And I was really lucky to have two of our staff, but also very sort of close friends, Mr. Loun and Mr. Noam, who were both with us. Mr. Loun, I've been to the monk forest with him many times before, so it's almost like we know what we're there to do. But with Mr. Noam, it was my first time. He's the project manager for the Green Shoots Agritech Center, and it was really almost heartwarming sort of walking with him because he had a lot of memories from his youth, being in sort of, trees which were in abundance all around town. He was reminiscing a lot about how it's less, and he, I think, just really kind of almost got whimsical, which in a way made me think of the power of Walk in the Woods as a methodology for this type of research, where it really brings out stories. We went with him because he has a big car and he drove us, and he was interested in coming, not knowing that, these stories are going to crop up. And I think it, of course, sort of he was pointing out trees and naming them. And the other thing that was surprising was when we had done a wild food sort of lunch at the Agri-Tech Center, he was really unfamiliar with a lot of the food that we were eating. And so I joked with him about it, and he's like, how can I ever forget it? This was my entire childhood, you know, and he's sort of similarly aged to me, maybe 5 years older than me. So it really made me think. But with Mr. Loun, we were there for our tasks, which is what we always do. So I've at times collected mushrooms with him. Other times I've collected plants to transplant. So he really knows. He comes equipped with the tools, and we both know that he's one of the star people of the Agri-Tech Center. And so yeah, so we took the main two main things that we did with him as part of the field work was firstly to take some soil samples of around specific plants that we decided, or trees rather. And the other thing was, what I also wanted to do was get a little bit of idea and document a little bit of the habitat and surroundings. So for that, I actually had one of Green Shoot's volunteers, Amelie, who was with us for about 2 weeks to do a lot more photography while we took plant samples. And we also took a few plants for transplanting. So we will try them again. So if I just mention the 5 plants, what they were. So one of them was Rumdul, which is a flower, like the national flower of Cambodia. It's an edible plant, but it's also very sort of beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. So it's definitely something that we would like to have at our Agri-Tech Center. And so I took a soil sample around that. It's also one of the essays that we have completed for our plant narratives. And then the other one was Padao, which is rattan plant. And for that, I think, you know, you and I both share a love for that plant, and it's sort of multi-use, has multiple uses in terms of making furniture. Of course, that's how everybody knows it, but it is an edible plant. The fruit are also edible, especially in other parts of Cambodia, other parts of Asia. And it can also be used to make sort of fishing nets and all kinds of other equipment. So very, very important and necessary plant, I think. So understanding the soil that it grows in and thrives in was important. And the other one is, so I have the Khmer name here. It's a tree. It's Dam Pong Ro, which the common name for that is Malay lac. So this was a tree that the monk pointed out to me. He said it's a very large tree. It has multi-uses. It's medicinal, but it's also very good wood for making equipment and things. And so he sort of so there was a monk that was walking with us. They always guide you through the forest. So seeing what we were doing, he pointed out and he said, why don't you take a sample of this and then you can try and grow it or make it available on your site. So I thought, okay, well, we'll take the monk's input. And then the fourth one was Tromong, which is Garcinia olivera. It's part of the mangosteen family, and it's something that is one of the most popular wild food plants. It's a plant that Dr. Powell's team is really working on making more commercially available. It's used primarily for making food taste acidic. It also has a fruit that is edible, and so that was definitely a, yes, plus. And then the fifth one and the final one was wild galangal, so Romdeng prey. So it's sort of a bulb that you take out. So we actually did take that one for transplanting, and we were to just try and understand what kind of soil these plants thrive in, because this was one that we had tried to transplant last year, but it didn't work. So it was, of course, let's try it again, but this time with the soil analysis. So the way we took the soil samples was simply by having one of those sort of boring type of implements, like a tool. And as it was the dry season, the ground was quite compacted. So just my strength alone wasn't working. So I had Mr. Loun bring in some of his muscles to really sort of push it down, and you go deep in, and then you pull out a soil sample. It was quite dry, so it did crumble, and it was not picture perfect where they come out as these cylindrical shape. And we bagged them in these sort of waterproof kind of like inside some coating bags, which are reusable. And the idea is that these samples were then sent to the Royal University of Agriculture, where they have a soil scientist who we know, as he's been involved in our project doing agroecology for agroecology. And she's going to be doing some tests on them. And is there anything you
Yeah, so you keep saying like a soil, we're collecting soil, but on a very basic level, I think we should kind of explain to everyone why that's so important. My knowledge of soil goes back to environmental science class in high school, IB Environmental Science with Mrs. Elaine Schutz, and I remember she was showing us this diagram of many different organic components that can compose what we know as dirt or soil. So correct me if I'm wrong, but we have like clay, we have sand, we have silt, and then we have loam, which is that really nutrient dense, rich, and softer component. And any mixture of these things creates what we know as dirt. And depending on the plant, as I'm guessing, and as we are trying to test right now with this project, certain compositions of those different elements is what makes this plant thrive,
yeah,
correct?
yeah.
So, could you explain more about dirt and
Yeah,
soil?
so yes, of course. Well, I know a lot of my friends do sort of hydroponics and vertical farming and everything, but all I'm going to say is soil is life. Soil is my favorite thing. And I love the smell, I love the texture, I just love being in it. And so, without geeking out too much, soil is essentially kind of broken, it's there's, as you mentioned, like you had a good grasp on it, but soil is essentially what makes plants thrive. It has nutrients, it has microorganisms, and it is literally full of life. But it has to be taken care of and it has to be looked after. And there's, organic material that helps sort of fix certain things to plants. It provides plants with nitrogen and all the components they need to grow. So it is what is part of the food. And yes, and I think perhaps as I talk about how we analyze the soil, it gives a better understanding of what components of soil are important for plant growth. So yeah, so it's really Miss Suklin who is at the RUA soil lab. She guided me on, doing pH testing because pH decides if this soil is acidic or alkaline, and you always know what is best for the plant that you want growing. So for example, if we take the galangal and we test the soil that it came from, if it will tell us, yes, that was like alkaline soil. So we know that this is what is a good thriving sort of condition for it. But then the other thing is soil organic matter. So this is all the other things that have broken down and kind of added to the soil. So when we make natural compost, that's basically soil organic matter because it's broken down organic matter, say like plant cuttings or kitchen waste. And then soil texture is what you were talking about. So it's this idea of clay, silt, sandy soil. So sandy soil is ones that kind of, it's like beach soil at the beach. It just allows the water through. It doesn't hold on to the water, whereas clay is something that really kind of holds on to the water. It's what makes soil quelch and, muddy. And then when it's dry season, that's what gets really compacted. And so what all plants need is this unique optimum kind of condition where, yes, we need better. So when plants sort of packets sort of say this requires well-drained soil, it's requiring something that's not so clayey. It's requiring something that allows water to pass through. And what we essentially can do as farmers or as kind of people that work in growing plants, create a mix that is ideal for the plant to grow in. And then the other thing that soil provides is NPK, so that the three sort of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So those are the three kind of elements that are vital for plant growth. A lot of people around the world unfortunately use chemical fertilizers to just plug this in, but this can be done naturally, and there are many ways that it can be done naturally. It might not be as quick and effective, but growing cover crops like legumes, as you might remember from biology, I think we probably studied it. It's the nitrogen cycle. So you plant beans to add nitrogen back into the soil, which is vital for plant growth. Wood ash, so that's after a barbecue, all the coal bits that are left behind, if you just chuck it onto your soil, it's excellent for adding phosphorus. And chicken manure and sort of horse manure is excellent also for adding potassium and phosphorus. So they're all like, these are natural ways, and they're all ways that we can apply, not just at the Agri-Tech Center, but also around the world. And they are sort of there to improve the soil quality. And so yeah, so that's what the soil scientist at RUA, she's guided me, or our project rather, doing a pH test to understand what kind of soil it is, and then what is the soil organic matter, which could give us a better idea of perhaps even other plants that were around, and then the soil texture and the NPK. So this kind of gives us a good snapshot of what's on the ground. And then what we've done is done a lot of photographs to see what other plants are shady or sort of bushy, like that kind of environment a plant needs to thrive. And I feel like putting those together can give us a good idea or a better suggestion on where we transplant these wild food plants, because we're certainly not going to do them in rows as we would do, say, tomatoes and aubergines. We'll have to dot them around the agri-tech center to give them that feeling of wild.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, because our listeners may also know about the NPK sort of trifecta of really important elements within soil. uh, Less familiar listeners might be wondering, but what am I reading about, online or in the newspapers about nitrogen crisis in soils around the world? So just to kind of contextualize this, it's really important that soil has these three elements within it so the plants can make use of those and grow. But as Muneezay was alluding to, with a lot of different, chemical, artificial fertilizers, they are enriched with lots of nitrogen and like so much that it pollutes the soil and even like the surrounding ecosystems, right? Like if you have excess nitrogen because of these synthetic fertilizers, when they're not fully absorbed, they end up in other places like the water or the
Yeah.
air or even erodes the soil, right?
Yeah, it's leaching, I think, is how some people would term it as well, where it just sort of comes out of the soil. And then the other thing is, and sorry if it gets too agricultural, is so certain plants that we grow, so like once you've planted rice, it's taken a lot from the soil. And, so the next stage naturally after that is, one of them is a lot of people burn the rice paddy, and that's a traditional method to add back wood ash back into. So you burn the paddy to put back the ash, but then the argument over there is it does destroy air quality, and also it does kill a lot of microorganisms that are in the soil. So there's quite a debate on doing it. I personally think it shouldn't be done anymore because there are other ways to make wood ash or apply other sort of materials to add the potassium into the soil. But cover crop is a key thing to plant right after you do a rice harvest. You plant a season of mung beans, it grows sort of Jan, Feb, March, it's ready to harvest. But what it does is it adds back nitrogen into the soil. So it's a constant cycle and that's of growing and planting. And that's also where things like crop rotation, which is really popular here in our parts of the world. If people are doing monoculture farming, they will do crop rotation to make sure that the things that get depleted naturally, because natural depletion also happens as you're growing things. But yeah, the chemical depletion is leaching out of these from the soil because you've added too much of the chemical fertilizer. So yeah, so we're still waiting on the results from the soil analysis, but I think as far as sort of fieldwork objectives go, it really guides us into sort of understanding a bit more the environment that wild food plants would need to thrive, and hopefully we can then kind of recreate that for them. And yeah, what we can do is in the description of the podcast, add the names of the plants that we took soil samples from around, and then that could sort of be something to update our listeners on.
Just trying to like imagine how we would create this experiment in an exhibition at a museum. And I just imagine a bunch of different glass vases filled with different color, I don't know, sand or something to represent each type of organic components. And sort of simulate how each plant takes what it needs. And then in that natural depletion or even that over depletion, maybe we have a greedy plant that wants more phosphorus, let's say, how that different colored component is like re-added into the soil over time. And I find it like very interesting that you highlighted this difference or like this traditional message, which is contentious because we don't often get to talk about, we people often think like, oh, traditional is overly positive or overly negative. And then here we have this kind of nuanced reflection where, yes, it helped during the time it was initially kind of most popular before we had different developments in agriculture and
Yeah.
food and
I mean,
plant growing?
it is the same as what they call slash and burn method, which is sort of way back historically, and probably used in other parts of the world. But what you have is larger fields now, so the field sizes are not as small as they used to be, and what you have is more people farming. So essentially, when everyone is burning a really large sort of 1 hectare, 4 hectare rice paddy at the same time, it's not a positive practice anymore. It's detrimental for human health as well, and environmental, because it does kill a lot of the tiny organisms that are in the soil that break down essentially the soil and organic matter. The other thing that I wanted to mention, because you brought up something, this idea of like, oh, maybe a plant is taking more phosphorus, is this idea of companion plants. So usually this what the theory is and what it is sometimes in practice, particularly in agriculture as well, is that certain plants thrive better together because one is taking what they need, and then the other one could be perhaps adding back what is needed. So it's this idea of companion planting, and it's extremely well recorded in sort of indigenous studies in North America about the three sisters planting method. And I think I'd really be very interested to know what exists in Cambodia around them, and how we can, and some of them are of course very understood, and it's things like kind of onions and potatoes don't go well together or something like that. But yeah, so I'm interested to see this idea of companion planting within the wild food system.
Should call it like the three apsaras or something. I have the three
Yeah.
sisters. The Khmer companion plants trio. I wonder what would they be to you, you think, from based on the Agritech
Oh,
Center? Do we have any trios?
oh, do we have any trios? I find them growing kind of eggplant and chili a lot together, but I think it's more to do with they just kind of consume together, perhaps, maybe, because it's sort of prahok and raw eggplant and a couple of chilies. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I'd look into a bit more. And yeah, right now I can't think of anything over the top of my head, but it's something to definitely think about.
Yeah, so this kind of knowledge about, the hypothetical three apsaras are growing and these companion plants and just which plants to look out for. That's something that we've found in our research, but also with conversations with people. There's just this continuous disparity, right? So we have a lack of scientific documentation in that way, but a very high working knowledge. But and this is just me speaking, right, or just kind of speculating, as we continue to kind of urbanize, younger people are moving into cities and they're also moving away from Cambodia. And though a lot of Cambodians still continue to farm and grow things, there's still kind of a disparity, right? Because, like, for example, Mr. Nom was like, oh, I don't know what these plants are, despite
Because
growing
he's
up
a
in this area.
city boy. Yeah.
He's a city boy, but city people
Yeah.
can also know about plants, right? Like there's
Yeah,
urban
yeah, no,
foragers.
yes, no, for sure. And I mean, I think there's the urban-rural sort of divide, especially in a place like Cambodia, is negligible because they're in such close proximity. A lot of people that live in the city might be growing up in Phnom Penh, but definitely lived at some point in the rural areas, go back to rural areas for Chumben, perhaps. So it's so much more fluid over there. But I think it's definitely interest-based, for sure. And it's also definitely people that are involved in food preparation are much more aware of the edible, like Sarin, who was our fixer, translator, everything person during our field work, and a really close friend of mine. He had immense knowledge, like he could point out, and I think also a drive for learning, because some of our key listeners might remember he featured in a story where he just asked us to eat something that we thought was then poisonous.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is like, while there is like an urban rural divide, and this is like a kind of general application, like stereotype for many different countries, the urban rural divide. I think what people should definitely know about Cambodia in particular is that it's not some remote isolated place where people don't move in between urban sector and stuff, but people live in the village. Like it was told to me by my research partner, Sophia Chen. She said that It's more of like krong, like Chibet krong and Chibet Phnom, so like village life and city life, but geographically, it's actually quite close. Like a few
Mm,
100 meters or like maybe a kilometer away can be like where that divide happens. But, people also have smartphones, so they're so connected to each other despite being or living in these rural areas. Right? Everyone loves Facebook in Cambodia, in my opinion.
everybody loves Facebook, yes. And I think that is sort of a nice way to kind of bring back to like the other kind of objective that I had with this field work, which was speaking with Net, who has the podcast has already featured. It's the one with Net where we interview her, who is a vlogger of particularly a wild food plants vlogger. And the real idea behind having that conversation with her was to understand how she sees her role as somebody who is creating knowledge, sharing it, but also engaging in dialogue with people that watch her videos and somehow almost co-creating new ways of eating. Because she mentioned that someone would tell her about, oh, do you know about this plant? And she would say, oh, I thought only it was for pig food, but actually she's like, then I tried it and it was great. So it's a new kind of digital communication, but then also a thriving interest, and it's all sort of knowledge that people hold and they're willing to share. So yeah, so my conversation with her was really around that, and I wanted to see kind of what were her kind of motivations, and which she shared, brilliantly, because I think she understood the value of having this knowledge and sharing it.
What's really great about Net's work or just her passion, because she's also a teacher, right? And this is something she does as a passion project that has taken its life of its own. I just wonder how it kind of addresses this disparity that I was saying earlier, where there's like the gap of scientific knowledge, whatever that means, with, working knowledge. And because she's right there in the middle, where she's kind
Mm,
of sharing with others her working knowledge of that, and people are actually doing and perhaps even revitalizing and kind of reorienting people on how they see a plant or interact with the plant. I know that TikTok during the pandemic was very, very popular for these foraging videos because people were trying to isolate from each other and social distancing and were being really close to nature. So a lot of foragers were posting videos on how to identify very common plants, like not like plants that which are not easily mistaken for poisonous ones. And people really getting back into nature and learning all these little skill sets. So similarly, maybe with Net's project and her work with wild food plants and foraging, she's probably inspiring people to reacquaint themselves with certain practices or to even try them for the first time, and really on her own way and her own method, really promoting Cambodian landscape eating. I guess like ecosystems eating, as well as an increased awareness, because there is this term that has been, widely disputed called plant blindness, which is this
mm.
idea that we don't even notice plants. But, dealing with this sort of negative connotation or at least implication of disability, that's not the case. A lot of people have been saying plant awareness. So I think that she's really promoting a Cambodian local plant awareness in other people, even through their smartphones or whatever types of technological devices they're using to watch her content.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, yeah, it is true. It's sort of, she features the plant, she really photographs it. She'll photograph it before it's picked, after it's picked, when it's ready on the plate. And it does, I am a strong believer of this idea that we see plants as this unanimous sort of green thing that's surrounding us, and all plants are plants, but there are certain plants that have kind of value in different ways. And I think for her, the other thing that she mentioned without sort of doing a recap of her episode was this idea that this knowledge might not be there for much longer. And she said, 30 years later, if my kid asks me what is this plant, I might have to just tell them to go and look at my YouTube channel. And so that idea of, these plants are in a fragile ecosystem. They're seeing them less, they're seeing them not in the season that they're supposed to be in, and things like that. So it's shifting and changing. And that's because land use is changing in Cambodia. Forests are getting less. So so yeah, so I think it almost becomes as much of an awareness tool as anything to direct attention towards, this plant is important, this is how we can use it. And 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 then you remember it a lot more. Like I remember every plant that I try and have eaten, and I can remember the taste, and I'm more aware of what it looks like, and and it stands out. So I think it's definitely working towards sort of that goal as well, to have these videos and document in this way.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we have today on the podcast. Is there anything you would like to add or conclude? For me, I think I would just like our listeners to take away that dirt is more interesting than you think. Soil is very wonderful and whimsical, and let's pay attention to plants. Even in the dry season, you still have a robust selection of different growing things around you. And yeah, there's always a reason to appreciate any season. Oh gosh, that rhymed. That wasn't
Mhm.
intentional.
Well, if you've dropped a rhyme, there's not much for me to end on. So no, I mean, enjoyed sharing everything that we did, and I hope to kind of put a little snippet in about how we're progressing with this living library that we're trying to create. So thank you all for your time.
All right. As with always, everyone, thank you for listening.
Bye.